The morning Callan Ashford lost everything did not begin with a courtroom ruling, a police investigation, or a dramatic confrontation. It began with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a building after years of ambition suddenly collide with a reality no one saw coming. At precisely 8:17 that morning, employees arrived at Ashford Global Holdings expecting another ordinary workday. Instead, security officers stood at the entrance with solemn expressions while managers quietly distributed cardboard boxes. Desks that had once symbolized careers built over decades were emptied in minutes. Family photographs disappeared into storage. Awards that celebrated extraordinary achievements were wrapped in newspaper alongside coffee mugs and office supplies. Phones rang without pause, yet no one seemed willing to answer them. Every conversation ended the same way, with uncertainty, disbelief, and a question nobody inside that gleaming headquarters could answer. What had happened to the man who only weeks earlier had been celebrated as one of the country's most admired business leaders? How could success disappear so completely without warning? Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Across the city, only a few miles away, another morning unfolded at an entirely different pace. The woman many believed had been left with nothing sat quietly on the porch of a modest countryside home, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee as the first light of dawn settled across the trees. Vivienne Ashford showed no sign of anger. There were no television cameras waiting outside her gate, no reporters seeking revenge-filled headlines, no celebration over another person's downfall. Instead, there was an expression that is difficult to describe unless you've witnessed someone finally lay down a burden they carried for far too long. Peace had replaced heartbreak.
The wind moved gently through the garden while birds welcomed another ordinary day. And for the first time in years, Vivienne watched the sun rise without wondering whether the man she loved would come home, tell another lie, or choose someone else over the woman who had stood beside him when he had nothing. If someone had passed by that porch, they never would have guessed that the calm woman sitting there had once stood at the very center of one of the most astonishing corporate collapses anyone could remember. At that exact same moment, inside a conference room nearly emptied of executives, Callan Ashford stared at a screen filled with numbers that no longer made sense. Contracts worth hundreds of millions had vanished almost overnight. Longtime investors who once competed for meetings suddenly refused to return a single phone call. Banks that had proudly advertised their partnership with his company informed him that every remaining line of credit had been suspended pending further review. Lawyers spoke carefully, accountants avoided eye contact, and trusted advisors who had spent years assuring him that his empire was untouchable now admitted they had no immediate solution. Everything Callan believed was permanent seemed to disappear one signature, one phone call, and one decision at a time. Yet the most painful realization had nothing to do with money. It was the growing understanding that this disaster had not begun inside a boardroom. It had not started in the stock market. It had begun much earlier, inside his own home, with a choice he convinced himself would bring happiness.
So let us ask the question that changed everything. How could one divorce destroy an empire that had taken decades to build? And perhaps an even more difficult question follows close behind. Did Vivienne Ashford secretly orchestrate Callan's collapse after years of betrayal? Or did Callan unknowingly destroy himself the very moment he chose another woman over the one person who had believed in him before anyone else did? At first glance, the answers appear obvious. Wealthy families, hidden influence, disappearing contracts, and business rivals make convenient explanations. But as every layer of this story unfolds, another truth begins to emerge, one that is far more personal than corporate and far more heartbreaking than financial. Because this is not simply a story about money disappearing. It is the story of gratitude forgotten, loyalty dismissed, promises abandoned, and the extraordinary cost of believing success belongs to one person alone. By the time this story reaches its final chapter, nearly every assumption you make today will be challenged. The woman who seemed powerless was carrying a history no one cared to understand. The man who believed he had finally reached the top would soon learn that the strongest foundations are often the ones we never notice until they disappear. Friends would quietly walk away. Trusted allies would reveal where their loyalty truly belonged. Relationships built over decades would collapse faster than anyone imagined possible. And through every painful turn, one question would remain impossible to ignore. Was Callan's greatest mistake falling in love with another woman? Or was it forgetting the immeasurable value of the woman who had quietly helped build every success he proudly called his own? The final revelation changes everything, and before this story ends, you'll understand why some losses cannot be measured by bank accounts, business empires, or public reputation, because the most devastating loss of all is often the one we recognize only after it is far beyond our reach. Callan Ashford had spent more than 20 years convincing the world that success belonged to those willing to outwork everyone else, and in many ways, he looked like living proof of that belief. Business magazines praised his determination. Industry conferences competed to have him speak on stage. Young entrepreneurs quoted his interviews as if they were instruction manuals for building wealth from nothing. To those watching from the outside, Callan represented the American dream in its purest form, a man who had started with little, endured years of rejection, and eventually built an empire that stretched across multiple states. Every achievement seemed to reinforce the same story. Every award appeared to confirm that relentless effort alone had carried him to the top. His employees admired him, investors trusted him, and competitors respected him. Yet there was one part of his story that never appeared in interviews or newspaper articles, one chapter that slowly disappeared every time someone introduced him as a self-made businessman. The people closest to Callan noticed the omission long before anyone else did, but few dared to question it. Success has a remarkable way of rewriting history, and the louder the applause became, the easier it was for everyone, including Callan himself, to believe the version of events that placed him alone at the center of every victory. That belief would eventually become the very foundation of his downfall, though he had no reason to suspect it as he walked confidently through the polished halls of his headquarters each morning. Standing quietly beside that celebrated success was Vivienne Ashford, a woman who rarely sought attention and never demanded recognition. Friends described her as graceful without trying to impress anyone, intelligent without needing to prove it, and compassionate even toward people who underestimated her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that often went unnoticed because she allowed others to occupy the spotlight while she remained content working behind the scenes. Employees who had known the company from its earliest days remembered seeing Vivienne delivering meals to exhausted staff during late-night deadlines, comforting families when financial uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone, and offering thoughtful advice that somehow solved problems before they became crises. Yet as the years passed and Callan's reputation grew, those memories gradually faded into the background. New executives assumed she was simply the businessman's supportive wife. Investors greeted her politely before shifting their attention back to Callan. Guests at elegant charity galas smiled at her kindly, without realizing they were standing beside someone whose judgment had quietly shaped countless decisions that protected the company through difficult years. Why did everyone underestimate Vivienne? Was it because she never demanded credit, or because people naturally preferred believing remarkable achievements were accomplished by a single extraordinary individual? The answer to that question would become far more important than anyone could imagine, because hidden strengths often remain invisible until the moment they are no longer there to hold everything together. It was during the height of Callan's success that another name slowly entered the picture, one that would alter the course of every life connected to the Ashford family. Celeste Hawthorne possessed the kind of effortless charm that immediately drew attention without appearing to seek it. She was articulate, polished, and remarkably skilled at making every conversation feel personal. When she entered a room, people noticed her confidence before they noticed anything else. She seemed to understand exactly what successful people longed to hear, and she had an uncanny ability to make them feel admired, understood, and exceptional. Callan first met Celeste during an exclusive fundraising gala attended by influential executives, philanthropists, and political leaders. Their introduction lasted only a few minutes, yet something about the encounter lingered in his mind long after the evening ended. Celeste asked thoughtful questions about his journey, laughed at stories he had repeated countless times, and spoke with genuine admiration about the empire he had supposedly built through determination alone. To Callan, it felt refreshing. To everyone watching from a distance, it appeared harmless. Yet there was something almost too perfect about the timing of her arrival, something difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Why had she entered his life precisely when his confidence had reached its highest point? Was it coincidence, careful calculation, or something far more complicated? Those questions would remain unanswered for now, quietly waiting for the right moment to reveal their significance. While new friendships formed and familiar routines continued, another mystery remained hidden beneath the surface of Callan Ashford's remarkable success. There were opportunities that had arrived at exactly the right moment, contracts that had been approved against overwhelming odds, financial obstacles that somehow disappeared before becoming public crises, and influential people who seemed unusually willing to trust a young entrepreneur still proving himself. Callan viewed each breakthrough as another reward for persistence, another confirmation that determination alone could overcome every obstacle. He never stopped to ask why doors opened when logic suggested they should have remained closed. He never questioned why powerful people who barely knew him extended extraordinary confidence in his vision. Most importantly, he never considered that someone else might have quietly been clearing obstacles long before he ever encountered them. The truth was not hidden because anyone wished to deceive him. It remained hidden because Callan never believed there was anything left to discover. Confidence slowly transformed into certainty, and certainty has a dangerous habit of convincing people they already possess every answer worth knowing. What didn't Callan understand about the remarkable rise of Ashford Global Holdings? And why would that missing piece of the story eventually become the key to explaining everything that followed? The answers already existed, quietly waiting beneath years of assumptions that had gone unchallenged. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, a single message appeared in Callan Ashford's inbox, surrounded by dozens of routine emails demanding his attention. It contained no company logo, no signature, and no explanation. There was only one sentence, written with unsettling simplicity. "You're about to lose more than your wife." Callan stared at the words for only a moment before dismissing them as the work of an internet prankster or a disgruntled stranger seeking attention. He deleted the email without forwarding it to anyone, without mentioning it to Vivienne, and without giving it another thought. After all, powerful people often receive strange messages, and Callan believed this one deserved no more significance than the countless anonymous opinions that accompanied public success. Yet unknown to him, that single sentence would echo through every chapter of the story still waiting to unfold. It was not a threat. It was not a warning intended to frighten him. It was something far more devastating. It was a simple statement of fact. By the time Callan Ashford finally understood what those words truly meant, his business empire, his marriage, his reputation, and everything he believed he had built entirely on his own would already be slipping beyond his reach, leaving him to confront a truth he had spent years refusing to see. Long before headlines celebrated Callan Ashford as a visionary entrepreneur, before investors competed for a seat at his conference table, and long before the polished headquarters bearing his company logo became a symbol of success, there was a very different reality hidden beneath the version of the story he would later tell the world. Callan's life was defined not by wealth, but by uncertainty. He and Vivienne Ashford shared a cramped apartment where every square foot served more than one purpose. The tiny kitchen doubled as an office. The dining table became a workspace covered with sketches, contracts, and unpaid invoices, and the living room often turned into a meeting space whenever Callan managed to convince a potential client to hear his ideas. Their furniture was mismatched, their savings barely existed, and every month seemed to bring another bill they weren't sure they could afford. Collection notices arrived more frequently than business opportunities, and there were evenings when the refrigerator held little more than leftovers carefully stretched into another meal. Yet despite the constant pressure, Callan never stopped talking about the future. He spoke with conviction about the company he believed would one day change his life, while Vivienne listened with the same quiet smile that had convinced him, from the very beginning, that impossible dreams were still worth chasing. She never laughed at his ambitions, never reminded him how unlikely success appeared, and never suggested he settle for something safer. Instead, she became the steady foundation beneath a dream that seemed ready to collapse more times than either of them could count. As the months turned into years, the weight of financial hardship grew heavier, but so did Vivienne's determination to keep hope alive. While Callan devoted every waking hour to building his company, she quietly accepted responsibility for everything else. She worked early mornings before sunrise, spent afternoons at another job, and often picked up evening shifts simply to make sure the lights stayed on and the rent was paid before another overdue notice appeared on their door. Exhaustion became part of her daily routine, yet she rarely complained. If Callan noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes or the fatigue hidden behind her gentle smile, he never fully understood what had caused them. Whenever another business proposal failed or another investor rejected his ideas, he returned home convinced he had disappointed the one person who still believed in him. Each time, Vivienne met him with the same reassuring words, reminding him that every successful journey included setbacks and that one difficult season did not define the rest of his life. Her encouragement wasn't loud or dramatic. It came through simple conversations over inexpensive dinners, handwritten notes tucked into his briefcase before important meetings, and quiet prayers whispered after he had fallen asleep, asking for another opportunity to arrive before hope finally disappeared. Unknown to Callan, her unwavering belief carried him through moments when his own confidence had nearly vanished. There came a season when even determination was no longer enough to keep the company alive. Bills mounted faster than revenue, suppliers demanded payment, and payroll deadlines approached with alarming speed. Every option Callan explored seemed to lead to another closed door. Investors considered his business too risky, banks refused additional credit, and trusted friends politely explained they could not afford to help. For the first time since launching the company, Callan seriously considered walking away. He spent an entire evening staring silently at the paperwork spread across their kitchen table before finally admitting to Vivienne that he believed the dream was over. He expected disappointment. Instead, Vivienne quietly stood, disappeared into their bedroom, and returned carrying a small wooden box that Callan had seen many times but had never opened. Inside were treasured family heirlooms passed down through generations, pieces of jewelry and keepsakes carrying memories that could never truly be replaced. Without hesitation, she placed the box on the table and gently told him that memories could live in the heart, but dreams needed a chance to survive. Within days, those precious belongings had been sold, providing just enough money to keep the company operating through its darkest chapter. Callan thanked her with tears in his eyes, promising that one day he would repay every sacrifice she had made. At that moment, he meant every word. Neither of them could imagine that years later, success would slowly blur the memory of promises made in the quiet moments when they had almost nothing. The breakthrough finally arrived when a regional business organization selected Callan Ashford to receive its Emerging Entrepreneur Award, recognizing his persistence despite overwhelming obstacles. It was not a nationally televised event, nor did it attract celebrity guests or major media coverage. But to Callan and Vivienne, it felt like the first real confirmation that years of sacrifice had not been in vain. As Callan stepped onto the stage to accept the modest Crystal Award, applause filled the room while Vivienne watched proudly from the audience, her eyes reflecting the same quiet joy she had carried through every difficult chapter of their journey together. Callan thanked mentors, colleagues, and supporters, speaking sincerely about resilience and determination, though he never fully captured the countless unseen sacrifices that had made the evening possible. As the applause faded and guests returned to their conversations, the camera of our story lingers on one distinguished older gentleman seated near the back of the ballroom. Dressed with understated elegance, he applauded politely before rising to leave without introducing himself to anyone. For only a brief moment, his eyes rested on Vivienne with unmistakable warmth before he quietly disappeared into the crowd. Neither Callan nor the audience understands the significance of that silent exchange. His identity remains unknown, his purpose unexplained, and his connection to Vivienne carefully concealed. But that mysterious gentleman is Alastair Beaumont, and although his name means nothing to Callan today, the truth behind that quiet presence will one day force him to question everything he ever believed about his success, his marriage, and the extraordinary woman who stood faithfully beside him when the rest of the world saw only another struggling dreamer. Success rarely arrives all at once. More often, it appears quietly, disguised as a single opportunity that opens the door to another, until one day the life that once seemed impossible becomes an everyday reality. That was exactly what happened to Callan Ashford. The investment that had once seemed impossible to secure was finally approved. The contract he had spent years chasing was signed without last-minute complications. One satisfied client introduced him to another, and before long, Ashford Global Holdings began growing at a pace even Callan had never imagined. Revenue climbed quarter after quarter, new offices opened across the country, and industry leaders who had once dismissed his ideas suddenly competed for the chance to work beside him. The small apartment where every dollar had been carefully counted became nothing more than a distant memory. In its place stood an extraordinary life filled with luxury homes overlooking breathtaking landscapes, elegant automobiles parked inside expansive garages, private jets waiting on airport runways, and exclusive memberships that opened doors to the country's most influential circles. Corporate awards lined the shelves of his office, while prestigious business magazines proudly featured Callan Ashford on their covers, celebrating him as one of America's most inspiring entrepreneurs. Television interviews praised his relentless determination. Podcasts invited him to share the secrets behind his remarkable rise, and audiences applauded every speech in which he described how persistence alone had carried him from hardship to extraordinary success. To the outside world, Callan's story had become the very definition of the American dream fulfilled. Yet wealth has a remarkable ability to reshape memory, often so gradually that the person changing never notices it happening. In the beginning, Callan still spoke often about the difficult years, acknowledging the long nights, the disappointments, and the sacrifices required to keep his dream alive. But with each passing year, another subtle change appeared. His interviews became shorter whenever questions turned toward the early struggles. Stories that once included Vivienne slowly became stories centered entirely around his own determination. When journalists asked what had made the difference, Callan smiled confidently and repeated the phrase that audiences loved to hear. He described himself as a self-made businessman who had refused to accept failure. The words sounded inspiring, and every standing ovation reinforced his growing belief that they were completely true. At first, Vivienne gently overlooked the omission, assuming he had simply forgotten to mention her during the excitement of another interview. Then it happened again, and again. Before long, it became the standard version of his story. The woman who had worked multiple jobs, sold precious family heirlooms, and carried the burden of their household while he pursued an uncertain dream quietly disappeared from public conversations. Her name no longer appeared in magazine profiles celebrating Callan's achievements. She was rarely invited on his stages during award ceremonies, and when photographers gathered to capture the faces behind Ashford Global Holdings, Vivienne often found herself standing just outside the frame. She never protested, never demanded recognition, and never corrected the narrative. She simply continued supporting the man she loved, hoping that success had merely distracted him rather than changed him. Unfortunately, there is a quiet danger in receiving constant admiration. The more people repeated that Callan had built everything on his own, the easier it became for him to believe it himself. It was during this season of celebration that fate introduced another chapter into Callan's life, one that would eventually unravel everything he believed he had achieved. An invitation arrived for an exclusive charity gala attended by influential executives, philanthropists, and political leaders from across the country. The evening was designed to celebrate generosity, innovation, and leadership, bringing together individuals whose names regularly appeared on magazine covers and financial news broadcasts. Callan attended as one of the event's honored guests, while Vivienne accompanied him with the same quiet elegance she had always carried. Throughout the evening, guests congratulated Callan on his latest accomplishments, praising his business instincts and speaking enthusiastically about the remarkable growth of Ashford Global Holdings. Vivienne smiled politely as conversation after conversation revolved around her husband, content to remain in the background while he accepted every compliment with increasing confidence. It was during one of these conversations that Callan was introduced to Celeste Hawthorne. She possessed a polished confidence that immediately commanded attention without appearing forced. Her words were carefully chosen, her smile warm enough to feel sincere, and her admiration for Callan seemed refreshingly genuine. Rather than discussing stock prices or corporate strategy, Celeste spoke about vision, perseverance, and the courage it took to transform impossible dreams into reality. She complimented not only his success, but also the determination she believed had made it possible. After years of hearing similar praise from strangers, there was something about Celeste's delivery that felt different. She listened closely, laughed at the right moments, remembered small details from previous interviews, and somehow made Callan feel as though he were the most fascinating person in the room. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he had begun craving. As the evening drew to a close, Callan and Celeste found themselves continuing their conversation away from the crowded ballroom, discussing business, ambition, and the challenges that came with public success. Nothing about their interaction appeared inappropriate to those passing by. They stood a respectful distance apart, exchanged polite smiles, and ended the conversation with a simple handshake before returning to the reception. Yet unseen by either of them, someone positioned across the grand ballroom quietly lifted a camera and captured several photographs of the encounter. One image froze the exact moment Celeste looked at Callan with unmistakable admiration, while he returned the expression with a smile rarely seen outside his closest relationships. Another photograph showed them standing together beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, appearing far more comfortable in each other's company than two people who had only just met. The photographer disappeared as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind no explanation and no indication that those seemingly harmless images had been taken at all. Callan returned home, believing the evening had been another successful networking event. Vivienne sensed a subtle change in his demeanor, but couldn't yet identify its source. Neither of them realized that those hidden photographs would soon become the first silent witnesses to a chain of events capable of destroying a marriage, reshaping an empire, and proving that the anonymous message waiting in Callan's inbox had never been an empty warning. It had been the beginning of a truth that was already moving steadily toward him, one choice at a time. What began as a seemingly innocent introduction at a charity gala gradually transformed into something neither Callan Ashford nor Celeste Hawthorne openly acknowledged, yet both quietly encouraged. At first, there were only occasional conversations about business opportunities and leadership. Then the conversations became longer. A quick exchange of emails turned into lengthy phone calls that stretched late into the evening. Soon, Callan found reasons to remain at the office long after everyone else had gone home, explaining to Vivienne that an important client needed immediate attention or that an unexpected conference call with overseas partners could not wait until morning. Those explanations sounded reasonable because they had once been true. During the difficult years of building Ashford Global Holdings, late nights had been part of the sacrifice both he and Vivienne willingly accepted. But this time, something felt different. The urgency seemed forced, the explanations rehearsed, and the warmth in Callan's voice slowly disappeared whenever he spoke to the woman who had stood beside him through every hardship. Business trips became more frequent than ever before, sometimes scheduled with only a day's notice. Meetings appeared on his calendar that no one else in the company seemed to know about. His phone, once carelessly left on the kitchen counter while he showered or answered the front door, never left his side. It remained face down during dinner, slipped quietly into his jacket whenever he stepped outside, and lit up with messages he no longer opened in front of Vivienne. Small changes, almost impossible to notice individually, slowly formed a pattern that spoke louder than words ever could. Vivienne Ashford noticed every one of those changes long before anyone else did. She recognized the hesitation before Callan answered simple questions about his day. She noticed how quickly he smiled while reading certain messages, only for that expression to vanish the moment she entered the room. She saw him becoming increasingly protective of his schedule, his phone, and even the smallest details of his daily routine. None of these moments alone proved anything. Yet together they painted a picture she desperately hoped was incomplete. Friends who occasionally visited their home sensed a quiet distance growing between them, though no one understood its cause. Callan remained polite, generous, and outwardly successful, while Vivienne continued greeting guests with grace and kindness, making every effort to preserve the image of a happy marriage. She never questioned him in front of others. She never searched through his belongings or demanded explanations. Instead, she watched with remarkable patience, almost as though she understood that truth has a way of revealing itself without being forced. There were evenings when Callan returned home carrying the faint scent of expensive perfume unfamiliar to their household. Other nights, he stepped outside to answer phone calls, speaking so softly that even the wind carried away his words before they reached the front door. Vivienne listened only to the silence that followed. She had learned years earlier that people determined to hide something often reveal more through their behavior than through their conversations. The audience now begins asking the same question she quietly asks herself. Does Vivienne already know what Callan refuses to admit? Or is she simply refusing to believe the evidence unfolding before her eyes? Meanwhile, Callan convinced himself that he remained in complete control of the situation. He told himself the growing connection with Celeste Hawthorne was harmless, that he deserved someone who admired his accomplishments without reminding him of the difficult years that had shaped his journey. Celeste understood exactly how to feed the confidence he had spent years building. She praised his ambition, celebrated every new achievement, and made him feel as though he had finally become the extraordinary man the world believed him to be. Lavish dinners became routine during business trips. Designer boutiques replaced ordinary shopping stops. Exclusive restaurants and luxury hotels offered privacy that made difficult questions easier to avoid. Expensive gifts quietly became another language through which Callan expressed feelings he refused to name aloud. Every carefully selected bracelet, elegant handbag, and bouquet delivered to Celeste's office strengthened a relationship he continued describing to himself as innocent friendship. Yet every thoughtful gesture carried another hidden cost. Each secret required another lie. Each lie demanded another excuse. And with every passing week, the emotional distance between Callan and Vivienne widened until conversations that had once lasted hours were reduced to polite exchanges about schedules, appointments, and obligations. The marriage that had survived financial hardship, disappointment, and years of uncertainty now faced a far greater challenge, not because of poverty or failure, but because success had quietly convinced one of them that loyalty could be taken for granted. The moment that changed everything arrived without warning on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Callan had returned home briefly before leaving for another out-of-town meeting, rushing through the house while speaking to someone on the phone. In his haste, he left a small velvet jewelry box inside the study, tucked beneath a stack of business documents he intended to pack later. Hours passed before Vivienne entered the room searching for paperwork connected to one of the family's charitable foundations. As she organized the scattered files, the elegant box slipped onto the floor. For a brief moment, she simply stared at it, recognizing immediately that it had not been there the day before. Slowly, she opened the lid. Resting inside was a breathtaking diamond necklace, its brilliance catching the afternoon sunlight pouring through the window. It was exquisite, chosen with extraordinary care, exactly the kind of gift any husband might purchase for the woman he loved. Yet Vivienne knew with complete certainty it was never meant for her. Their wedding anniversary was months away. There had been no birthday celebration, no special occasion, and no handwritten note carrying Callan's familiar signature. More telling than anything else was the small gift receipt tucked discreetly beneath the necklace. Printed neatly across the top was the name of an exclusive boutique Callan had never once visited with her. Beneath it was a delivery instruction listing a date that had already passed, followed by a handwritten initial that did not belong to Vivienne Ashford. She gently closed the box exactly as she had found it, returned it to its place, and quietly walked out of the room without shedding a single tear. She did not confront Callan. She did not call friends seeking advice. She simply sat alone on the back porch as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying a silence heavier than any argument could ever have been. In that quiet moment, Vivienne no longer searched for proof. She had found it. The only question that remained was how much of the truth still waited to reveal itself before Callan Ashford finally realized that every secret has a way of finding the light, no matter how carefully it is hidden. After discovering the diamond necklace, something inside Vivienne Ashford quietly changed. She did not become bitter, nor did she allow anger to consume the kindness that had always defined her character. Instead, she accepted a painful reality that her heart had been trying to deny for months. The evidence was no longer made up of subtle glances, unanswered questions, or late-night excuses. It had become impossible to ignore. Yet remarkably, Vivienne continued treating Callan Ashford with the same dignity she had shown him since the earliest days of their marriage. She still prepared breakfast before he left for work. She still wished him a safe trip whenever another unexpected business meeting appeared on his calendar. She still welcomed guests into their home with warmth and grace, ensuring no one felt uncomfortable because of the growing silence between husband and wife. To anyone looking from the outside, they remained the image of a successful couple enjoying the rewards of years of hard work. Only those living inside that beautiful house understood how empty it had become. Conversations that once stretched late into the evening had been replaced by brief exchanges measured in minutes. Laughter had disappeared almost entirely. Even the simple habit of sharing coffee together each morning slowly faded until they often started and ended their days in separate parts of the house. The greatest distance between two people is not always measured in miles. Sometimes it exists beneath the same roof, growing wider with every word left unspoken. Callan, meanwhile, seemed almost unaware of how much he had changed. Success had given him confidence, admiration had strengthened his pride, and the constant attention surrounding his achievements slowly convinced him that every decision he made deserved little explanation. He no longer sought Vivienne's opinion before making important choices, something that had once been a natural part of their relationship. Invitations to business dinners arrived addressed only to him. Corporate celebrations became opportunities for networking rather than moments shared with the woman who had helped make those milestones possible. When friends gathered for dinner or charity events, Callan increasingly treated Vivienne less like a partner and more like an afterthought. It began with small remarks disguised as humor. He joked that she wouldn't understand certain business discussions because she preferred a quieter life. When someone complimented the elegant home they had built together, he casually replied that success required difficult sacrifices, speaking as though he alone had carried every burden. The comments were subtle enough to make others laugh politely, yet each one quietly erased another piece of Vivienne's contribution from the story they had lived together. On one unforgettable evening, while entertaining several influential investors and longtime friends, Callan introduced Vivienne with a smile before saying, "She kept the home running while I built the company." The room responded with light applause and approving nods, never realizing how deeply those few words wounded the woman standing beside him. Vivienne smiled politely, excused herself to refill the guest's coffee, and never corrected him. No one in that room knew she had once worked multiple jobs, sacrificed treasured family heirlooms, and carried the weight of their survival long before Ashford Global Holdings ever turned a profit. History had been rewritten in a single sentence, and everyone accepted it without question. If there was one person who openly encouraged the growing distance between Callan and Vivienne, it was Eleanor Ashford. From the very beginning of their marriage, Eleanor had respected Vivienne's kindness but questioned whether she truly belonged beside a man whose ambitions seemed destined for extraordinary success. As Callan's wealth and influence expanded, Eleanor's opinions became increasingly difficult to ignore. She spoke often about appearances, social standing, and the importance of having a wife who reflected the image of a powerful executive. During private conversations with her son, she suggested that people in his position eventually outgrew relationships formed before success arrived. According to Eleanor, Vivienne represented the past, while the future required someone who understood elite social circles, glamorous events, and the lifestyle now surrounding Callan's career. She never openly criticized Vivienne's character because there was little to criticize. Instead, she questioned whether kindness alone was enough for the life Callan now lived. She praised women who commanded attention in every room and admired those who seemed naturally comfortable among celebrities, politicians, and corporate leaders. Without ever mentioning Celeste Hawthorne directly, Eleanor described exactly the kind of woman she believed her son deserved. Each conversation planted another small seed inside Callan's mind, reinforcing thoughts that had already begun taking shape. What Callan failed to recognize was that Eleanor measured success through appearances, while Vivienne had always measured it through loyalty, sacrifice, and character. Those two definitions could never coexist for long. As weeks passed, the changes became impossible for anyone close to the Ashford family to ignore. Celeste Hawthorne appeared more frequently at corporate functions, industry conferences, and exclusive charity events where Vivienne had once stood proudly beside her husband. At first, Celeste attended as an invited guest, then as a trusted business associate, and eventually as the woman everyone expected to see walking beside Callan during public appearances. Rumors quietly spread through executive circles, though no one dared confront Callan directly. Magazine photographers captured smiling images of him and Celeste attending fundraising dinners, leadership summits, and networking receptions, presenting them as two influential professionals whose partnership represented the future of modern business. Vivienne noticed every headline without saying a word. She watched television interviews in which Callan spoke confidently about leadership while avoiding every mention of the family waiting for him at home. Friends who once called regularly became strangely distant, uncertain how to navigate the growing tension surrounding the Ashford marriage. Some chose silence out of loyalty. Others avoided the situation entirely. Through it all, Vivienne remained composed. Her calmness puzzled everyone around her. How could someone facing such public humiliation remain so peaceful? Had she accepted defeat, or did she know something no one else understood? That question lingered quietly as another unexpected moment arrived. One quiet afternoon, while organizing documents for one of the charitable foundations she continued supporting despite everything happening around her, Vivienne's phone rang. The number displayed no name, only a private line she seemed to recognize immediately. She stepped onto the back porch before answering, her voice soft enough that no one inside the house could hear the conversation. The call lasted less than a minute. She listened carefully, asked no questions, and remained completely still as the person on the other end spoke. Finally, after several moments of silence, Vivienne closed her eyes and replied with only 5 words. "It's finally happening." There was no excitement in her voice, no satisfaction, no relief, only quiet certainty, as though she had been expecting this call for a very long time. She ended the conversation, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and stood alone watching the evening sky fade into shades of gold and crimson. The audience is left with another mystery. Who made that phone call? What had finally begun? And why did Vivienne seem prepared for news that would have surprised anyone else? Those answers remain hidden for now, but somewhere beyond the peaceful silence of that porch, events already set in motion were moving steadily toward Callan Ashford, bringing with them consequences far greater than he had ever imagined. The days following that mysterious phone call unfolded with an almost unsettling calm, as though life itself had paused before revealing the next chapter. Callan Ashford continued living as though nothing significant had changed. He attended meetings, appeared on financial news programs, accepted invitations to exclusive events with Celeste Hawthorne by his side, and spoke confidently about ambitious expansion plans for Ashford Global Holdings. If he noticed Vivienne Ashford's quiet composure, he mistook it for acceptance. He convinced himself that she had finally understood their marriage had reached its natural conclusion. What Callan failed to recognize was that silence should never be confused with surrender. Vivienne was not waiting for him to change his mind, nor was she searching for another opportunity to save a relationship she had already spent years protecting alone. She had simply reached the point where love could no longer survive without respect. The woman who had once carried hope through seasons of poverty now carried something very different. It was the quiet strength that comes from accepting a painful truth without allowing it to destroy the person you are. She moved through the house with the same grace she always had, smiling politely at the staff, tending to the garden she loved, and continuing her charitable work as though every ordinary moment still deserved kindness. Yet beneath that calm exterior, she knew the conversation she had spent months expecting was now only a matter of time. That conversation arrived on a Sunday evening beneath the polished chandeliers of the Ashford family dining room. It had been presented as an ordinary family dinner, one of the few occasions when everyone gathered around the same table. Eleanor Ashford sat confidently beside her son, exchanging pleasant conversation with relatives and close family friends while the household staff quietly served the evening meal. Vivienne joined them with her usual warmth, greeting each guest before taking her seat across from Callan. For a brief moment, everything appeared perfectly normal. Laughter drifted through the room, crystal glasses reflected the soft candlelight, and anyone passing by would have believed they were witnessing the dinner of a close, successful family. Then Callan gently placed his knife and fork onto his plate and cleared his throat. The room fell silent almost immediately. Without hesitation, without emotion, and without looking directly into Vivienne's eyes, he announced that he believed their marriage had reached its end. He spoke calmly, describing the decision as something he had carefully considered for many months. According to Callan, they had simply grown into different people with different futures. He insisted there was no point pretending otherwise. Before anyone else could respond, he turned toward Vivienne and, with astonishing coldness, asked her to leave the house immediately so they could begin separate lives without unnecessary delay. The words echoed through the dining room with a finality that left every guest speechless. Even those who suspected difficulties within the marriage had never imagined Callan would choose such a moment, surrounded by family, to end the relationship that had carried him from struggle to extraordinary success. For several long seconds, no one moved. Eleanor Ashford lowered her eyes, but offered no objection. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Every face in the room eventually turned toward Vivienne, waiting for tears, anger, or desperate pleas to reconsider. Instead, she slowly placed her napkin beside her untouched dinner plate and looked at Callan with an expression neither bitter nor broken. It was the look of someone who had finally reached the end of a long and painful journey. Without raising her voice, she quietly thanked everyone for sharing the evening, rose gracefully from her chair, and walked upstairs. No doors slammed. No accusations filled the hallways. She carefully opened the bedroom closet and selected only the belongings that truly belonged to her. A few pieces of clothing, several family photographs, personal journals, and a small wooden keepsake box were placed neatly inside two modest suitcases. She paused only once, her hand resting gently on an old framed photograph taken years earlier in the tiny apartment where she and Callan had celebrated his first business contract with inexpensive takeout food and boundless hope. A faint smile crossed her face before she carefully wrapped the photograph and placed it inside her suitcase. She carried no jewelry purchased during their years of wealth, no expensive artwork, and none of the luxury surrounding her. The woman who had once helped build everything quietly chose to leave with only memories that money could never replace. When Vivienne returned downstairs carrying her suitcases, the silence inside the house felt heavier than before. Callan stood waiting near the front entrance, convinced the difficult moment would soon be over. Their eyes met one final time. Vivienne stepped closer, not with anger, but with remarkable compassion for the man standing before her. Then, in a calm voice that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives, she spoke a single sentence. "I hope one day you understand what you're throwing away." There was no threat hidden within those words, no promise of revenge, no attempt to frighten him. Only quiet sadness for someone who could not yet see the value of what he was willingly losing. She opened the front door and walked outside without looking back. The door closed gently behind her, leaving Callan convinced he had finally taken control of his future. But before anyone inside could resume the evening, the distant sound of approaching engines interrupted the silence. One by one, several black SUVs turned slowly onto the private driveway, their polished exteriors reflecting the lights of the Ashford estate. They moved with quiet precision before coming to a stop directly in front of the house. Neighbors watching through nearby windows paused in confusion. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Even Eleanor Ashford rose from her chair, unable to hide her curiosity. No one recognized the vehicles, and no one understood why they had arrived at that exact moment. The first vehicle's door opened, and a distinguished older gentleman stepped onto the driveway with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding respect without demanding attention. His silver hair, tailored suit, and composed expression gave no hint of unnecessary extravagance, yet everything about him reflected remarkable influence. Without acknowledging the stunned faces watching from inside the house, he walked directly toward Vivienne Ashford. She did not appear surprised. Instead, her eyes softened with the warmth of someone seeing a beloved family member after a long separation. As he reached her, the gentleman embraced her gently before placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. In a voice filled with both affection and quiet authority, he spoke words that instantly changed everything. "Come home, my daughter." Time itself seemed to stop. Inside the house, Callan Ashford stood frozen, unable to process what he had just witnessed. The room behind him remained silent, as every guest struggled to understand the meaning of those four simple words. The mysterious gentleman was Alastair Beaumont. Until that moment, Callan had never heard the name spoken with any significance. Yet standing on his own driveway, watching the woman he had just cast out embraced by a man whose presence alone seemed to command extraordinary respect, he felt something he had not experienced in many years. For the very first time since achieving success, certainty gave way to confusion. The questions began arriving faster than answers. Who was Alastair Beaumont? Why had Vivienne never spoken about him? And why did everyone accompanying those black SUVs carry themselves as though they had not come to rescue a woman who had lost everything, but to welcome home someone whose true story had only just begun to be revealed? For several long moments after the black SUVs came to a stop, no one standing on the Ashford estate seemed capable of speaking. The silence was unlike anything they had experienced before. It was the kind of silence that arrives when an entire room suddenly realizes the story it believed for years was missing its most important chapter. Callan Ashford remained frozen near the front entrance, his eyes fixed on the older gentleman who had just embraced Vivienne Ashford with unmistakable affection. Eleanor Ashford looked from her son to Vivienne and back again, desperately searching for an explanation that made sense. The guests whispered among themselves, trying to identify the distinguished visitor whose presence alone seemed to command extraordinary respect. Even the professional drivers standing beside the black SUVs carried themselves with quiet discipline, suggesting this was no ordinary family reunion. Vivienne herself remained remarkably composed. She neither celebrated the confusion surrounding her nor attempted to explain anything before the right moment. She simply stood beside the older gentleman with the same quiet grace she had carried throughout every painful chapter of her marriage. The woman everyone believed had just lost her home looked strangely at peace, while the man who believed he had finally freed himself from an unhappy marriage suddenly found himself surrounded by questions he could not answer. The older gentleman turned toward Callan with calm, measured steps, extending the courtesy of introducing himself despite the extraordinary circumstances. His voice was steady, dignified, and carried the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that affected thousands of people. "My name is Alastair Beaumont," he said simply. The name meant nothing to Callan at first. He searched his memory, convinced he had heard it somewhere before, but nothing came immediately to mind. Then, almost instinctively, several of the guests exchanged startled glances. One executive quietly lowered his head, recognizing the name instantly. Another guest whispered it beneath his breath, almost in disbelief. For decades, the Beaumont family had remained largely absent from newspaper headlines despite being one of America's most influential private investment families. Unlike corporate giants who constantly sought publicity, the Beaumonts had built their reputation through discretion, long-term partnerships, and carefully selected investments that quietly shaped industries without attracting unnecessary attention. They rarely appeared on magazine covers, avoided celebrity culture, and preferred influence over recognition. Their wealth was immense, but their greatest strength had always been patience. They believed real power did not need to announce itself. It simply existed, shaping outcomes while remaining invisible to those too distracted to notice. Standing before Callan Ashford was the man who had spent a lifetime protecting that legacy, and beside him stood the daughter whose identity had remained hidden throughout her entire marriage. As the truth slowly unfolded, the audience finally understands what had been quietly concealed from the very beginning. Vivienne Ashford was not the ordinary woman everyone assumed she was. She was Alastair Beaumont's only daughter, raised in a family where privilege was never meant to replace character, and where wealth was viewed as a responsibility rather than a measure of personal worth. From an early age, Alastair had taught her that genuine relationships could never be built upon money alone. He often reminded her that fortune had an unfortunate habit of attracting admiration that disappeared the moment the fortune itself was gone. Those lessons stayed with Vivienne long into adulthood. When she met Callan Ashford years earlier, she made a decision that surprised even her own family. She chose not to reveal her last name, her family's influence, or the extraordinary resources available to her. She wanted to know whether a man would love her for the person she was rather than for the life she could provide. Alastair respected that decision, even though he understood the risks it carried. He watched from a distance as his daughter built a simple life with the man she believed shared her values. He witnessed their struggles, their sacrifices, and the years they spent believing success remained uncertain. More than once, members of the Beaumont family questioned whether Vivienne should reveal the truth, but she always answered the same way. If he loves me only after learning who I am, then he never truly loved me at all. Those words reflected the quiet strength that had defined her entire life. She never wanted to purchase affection with influence. She wanted a marriage rooted in honesty, loyalty, and shared dreams. Standing there beneath the evening sky, Callan struggled to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the extraordinary reality now unfolding before him. Every memory from their years together began taking on an entirely different meaning. He remembered how rarely Vivienne spoke about her childhood, how she always redirected conversations whenever someone asked detailed questions about her family, and how she politely declined invitations to discuss her personal background during interviews. At the time, Callan never considered those details important. He had been too focused on building his own future to ask meaningful questions about hers. He assumed her quiet nature meant there was little to discover. He never wondered why she carried herself with effortless confidence among influential people despite claiming to come from an ordinary background. He never questioned how she seemed perfectly comfortable speaking with diplomats, philanthropists, and industry leaders whenever their paths crossed. Most painfully of all, he never stopped to ask what sacrifices she had made long before entering his life. Callan believed he knew everything that mattered about the woman he married, but standing before Alastair Beaumont, he realized he had spent 15 years loving someone whose deepest story he had never truly taken the time to understand. The tragedy was not that Vivienne had hidden her identity. The tragedy was that Callan had stopped being curious enough to ask about the person standing beside him every single day. Before Callan could gather his thoughts, another figure quietly stepped forward from one of the waiting vehicles. Dressed in a tailored dark suit and carrying a leather portfolio worn smooth by decades of careful use, the gentleman approached with calm professionalism. Alastair turned slightly toward him before saying, "Callan, this is Gideon Mercer." The name was immediately familiar. Callan had heard it mentioned in legal circles for years. Gideon Mercer was widely respected as one of the country's most accomplished corporate attorneys, known for representing some of America's most influential families while avoiding publicity whenever possible. Gideon offered a polite nod before opening the portfolio in his hands. His expression revealed neither anger nor satisfaction. He spoke with the measured precision of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths without emotion. Looking directly at Callan, he asked a single question that seemed almost impossible to understand in that moment. "Do you know who has quietly protected your company for the past 15 years? The words settled over the gathering like a heavy silence. Callan frowned, instinctively preparing to answer, but nothing came. Gideon allowed the question to linger, giving it time to sink into every mind present. The audience immediately remembers every mystery planted since the beginning of the story. The contracts approved against impossible odds, the investors who appeared at precisely the right moments, the banks willing to extend trust when others refused, and the anonymous warning that had arrived in Callan's inbox long before everything began to collapse. Suddenly, those scattered pieces no longer seemed unrelated. They were fragments of a truth that had quietly existed from the very first chapter. And for the first time since this story began, Callan Ashford realizes that the empire he proudly called self-made may have been standing upon a foundation he never knew existed. The conversation with Alastair Beaumont and Gideon Mercer ended without raised voices, threats, or dramatic accusations. There was no declaration of revenge, no promise to destroy Ashford Global Holdings, and no attempt to humiliate Callan Ashford in return for everything that had happened. Alastair simply placed a reassuring hand on Vivienne Ashford's shoulder before escorting her toward one of the waiting vehicles. Gideon closed his leather portfolio with the same quiet professionalism he had displayed from the moment he arrived. Before stepping away, he looked at Callan one final time and said, "Every decision has consequences, Mr. Ashford. Sometimes those consequences have already begun long before we recognize them." With that, the convoy departed as calmly as it had arrived, leaving behind a driveway filled with unanswered questions and a family still struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. Callan remained standing outside long after the vehicles disappeared beyond the gates of the estate. He replayed Gideon Mercer's question repeatedly in his mind. Who had quietly protected your company for the past 15 years? The words refused to leave him. For the first time in decades, certainty abandoned him completely. The confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations suddenly gave way to doubt, and somewhere deep inside, an uncomfortable realization began taking shape. There were chapters of his own success that he had never truly understood. Only 3 days later, the first signs of trouble appeared. What initially seemed like an isolated business setback quickly developed into something far more serious. A long-negotiated acquisition unexpectedly collapsed after the other company withdrew without explanation. Executives inside Ashford Global Holdings assumed it was a temporary delay until another phone call arrived. This time, it was an international supplier quietly informing the company they would not be renewing a partnership that had existed for more than a decade. Before management could adjust to the unexpected news, another development followed. A major financial institution that had proudly supported Ashford Global Holdings since its earliest years informed Callan that several lines of credit would be suspended pending an internal review. The explanation sounded polite, almost routine, but experienced executives inside the company recognized the seriousness of what was happening. Within 48 hours, scheduled meetings with investors were canceled one after another. Some offered vague scheduling conflicts. Others simply stopped returning phone calls altogether. The confidence that had surrounded Ashford Global Holdings for years began disappearing with astonishing speed. Employees noticed the change before anyone officially acknowledged it. Hallway conversations became quieter. Department heads held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Rumors spread through every office floor as uncertainty replaced the optimism that had once defined the company. Callan insisted everything remained under control, but even he could not ignore how quickly familiar faces were becoming impossible to reach. The days that followed brought an avalanche of setbacks unlike anything Callan Ashford had experienced throughout his career. Board members who had praised his leadership only weeks earlier quietly submitted their resignations, each citing personal reasons or changes in professional direction. Several longtime investors sold significant portions of their holdings without issuing public criticism, choosing instead to walk away with remarkable silence. Financial analysts who had once predicted years of continued growth suddenly revised their expectations, triggering another wave of concern throughout the market. As confidence weakened, the company's stock price began falling at a pace few believed possible. Every morning seemed to introduce another headline questioning the future of Ashford Global Holdings. News anchors who had once celebrated Callan's achievements now spoke cautiously about mounting uncertainty surrounding the company's stability. Television commentators searched for explanations, suggesting everything from poor strategic decisions to hidden legal complications. Inside headquarters, phones rang constantly as anxious shareholders demanded answers no one could confidently provide. Employees who had devoted years of loyal service quietly carried cardboard boxes through the same hallways where celebrations had once filled the air. The heartbreaking scenes witnessed in the opening moments of this story were no longer distant possibilities. They had become reality. Watching everything unfold, Callan convinced himself that someone had deliberately orchestrated an attack against him. There had to be a hidden enemy. No successful company could unravel this quickly without someone pulling invisible strings behind the scenes. That explanation became easier to accept than confronting a far more uncomfortable truth. Determined to uncover whoever was responsible, Callan instructed attorneys, investigators, and senior executives to examine every recent business decision. They searched for corporate sabotage, illegal interference, leaked information, and coordinated efforts by competitors seeking to weaken Ashford Global Holdings. Every possibility was explored. Every theory was investigated. Yet each report returned with the same frustrating conclusion. No evidence suggested that anyone had launched an attack against the company. There were no secret lawsuits manipulating the market. No rival corporation had engineered the collapse. No government agency had targeted Callan unfairly. The business relationships ending one after another had all reached their conclusions through entirely legal and voluntary decisions. Contracts expired and were simply not renewed. Investors exercised their right to invest elsewhere. Banks reevaluated financial exposure according to internal policy. Board members resigned without violating any corporate obligations. Nothing illegal had occurred because nothing had been forced. The truth proved almost impossible for Callan to accept precisely because it was so simple. Vivienne Ashford had never asked her family to punish him. She had never requested revenge, demanded financial retaliation, or encouraged Alastair Beaumont to destroy the company Callan believed he had built alone. The Beaumont family had done something far less dramatic and far more powerful. They had simply stopped providing the quiet confidence, trusted introductions, and unseen support that had protected Ashford Global Holdings for 15 years. The invisible foundation beneath Callan's empire had not been ripped away. It had merely been allowed to stand on its own for the very first time. Without realizing it, Callan had mistaken borrowed stability for permanent strength. While Ashford Global Holdings struggled to survive, another disappearance unfolded far from the financial headlines. At first, Callan barely noticed it amid the growing crisis consuming every hour of his day. Then one evening, after several unanswered phone calls, he realized Celeste Hawthorne had become strangely unreachable. Her assistant politely explained she was unavailable. Messages went unanswered. Scheduled dinners were quietly canceled. The luxury apartment where Callan had occasionally visited now stood dark night after night. Mutual acquaintances claimed they hadn't spoken to her recently, though something in their voices suggested they knew more than they were willing to share. Weeks earlier, Celeste had eagerly celebrated every business success alongside him, offering admiration, encouragement, and unwavering confidence in his future. Now, as that future began slipping away, she vanished with remarkable efficiency, leaving behind only unanswered questions and uncomfortable silence. The realization struck Callan with painful clarity. The woman for whom he had sacrificed his marriage seemed to have disappeared the very moment his influence began fading. Standing alone inside his increasingly empty office, surrounded by framed awards that suddenly felt meaningless, Callan found himself confronting another question he had spent months avoiding. Had Celeste Hawthorne ever truly loved him, or had she simply loved the powerful man she believed he would always remain? That answer, like so many others in his life, was now moving steadily toward him, and when it finally arrived, it would leave no room for denial. For weeks, Callan Ashford convinced himself there had to be a reasonable explanation for Celeste Hawthorne's sudden disappearance. He told himself she was overwhelmed by the relentless media attention surrounding Ashford Global Holdings. Perhaps she simply needed time away from the public eye until the uncertainty surrounding his company settled. That explanation brought him temporary comfort, but with every passing day it became increasingly difficult to believe. Calls continued going unanswered. Messages remained unread. The warm conversations that had once filled his evenings vanished without warning, replaced by silence that echoed far louder than any argument ever could. Even the places they had once visited together seemed to erase every trace of her existence. Restaurant managers politely informed him she had not been there in weeks. Hotel staff who had once greeted them warmly now claimed not to remember her. It was as though an entire chapter of his life had quietly disappeared overnight. The woman who had constantly assured him she admired his vision, respected his ambition, and believed in his future had become impossible to find at the exact moment his future no longer appeared guaranteed. Yet despite everything happening around him, Callan refused to accept what his instincts were already beginning to tell him. He clung to hope because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that he had sacrificed the one person who genuinely loved him for someone who might never have loved him at all. The answer arrived unexpectedly through someone Callan had not spoken to in years. During an industry conference held several months after the collapse of Ashford Global Holdings, a former business associate approached him with visible hesitation. The conversation began politely enough, centered on market conditions and changing economic trends, before the man paused and quietly asked a question that immediately caught Callan's attention. "I thought Celeste Hawthorne had moved on," he said with genuine surprise. Callan felt his heart tighten. Before he could respond, the gentleman apologized, believing Callan already knew. He explained that he had recently attended an exclusive fundraising gala hosted by one of the country's fastest-growing investment firms. During the event, Celeste had been introduced as the companion of another celebrated
make a powerful
executive
team,
whose
Celeste.
fortune had grown substantially over the previous year. According to those in attendance, the pair appeared inseparable, laughing comfortably together as photographers captured image after image of what many described as the city's newest power couple. Callan listened without interrupting, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. His associate noticed the confusion on his face and quietly offered to send him a recent magazine article covering the event. A few minutes later, the message arrived. Callan hesitated before opening it, almost fearing what he might discover. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the photographs waiting on the screen before him. There she was. Celeste Hawthorne stood beneath sparkling chandeliers wearing the same confident smile that had once captivated him during their first meeting. Her elegant gown reflected the glamour of the evening, while cameras flashed around her without pause. Beside her stood another wealthy executive, a man whose recent financial success had made him one of the most discussed figures in the business world. They appeared relaxed, affectionate, and remarkably familiar with one another. The accompanying article praised the executive's extraordinary achievements and referred to Celeste as his constant source of encouragement and inspiration, using almost the very same language journalists had once used when describing her relationship with Callan. As he continued reading, Callan noticed phrases that felt painfully familiar. She reportedly admired the executive's vision. She was said to appreciate his determination. Friends described how deeply she believed in his future. Every compliment mirrored the words she had once spoken to Callan, almost as though the script had simply been handed to someone new. He enlarged one of the photographs and stared silently at the expression on Celeste's face. It was the same smile she wore while telling him he inspired her, the same look she had given him during business dinners, charity events, and private conversations. Only now it belonged to someone else. In that heartbreaking moment, the final illusion began to crumble. The affection he believed was unique had simply become another carefully repeated performance. Callan closed the article and remained seated for a long time, allowing memories to return one by one with painful clarity. He remembered the excitement he felt every time Celeste praised his accomplishments. He remembered believing she understood him better than anyone else because she admired the man he had become instead of reminding him of the difficult years behind him. He remembered convincing himself that what he felt for her represented a new beginning rather than a dangerous escape from responsibilities he no longer wished to carry. Looking back now, he realized something he had been too blinded by pride to recognize before. Celeste Hawthorne had entered his life at the precise moment his success reached its highest point. She celebrated every promotion, every award, every interview, every headline, and every symbol of influence surrounding Ashford Global Holdings. Yet the moment those symbols began disappearing, so did she. She never stood beside him during sleepless nights spent worrying about payroll. She never encouraged him after painful rejection. She never sacrificed comfort to protect his dream. Those chapters belonged entirely to Vivienne Ashford. Celeste had arrived only after the hardest battles had already been won. She admired the finished empire, but had no interest in helping rebuild its ruins. For the first time since everything began falling apart, Callan stopped searching for excuses. He finally understood that Celeste had never fallen in love with the man he truly was. She had fallen in love with the image the world celebrated, and once that image faded, there was nothing left for her to hold on to. The realization struck with a force greater than the loss of contracts, investors, or public admiration. Money could be earned again. Businesses could be rebuilt. Reputations, though difficult to restore, sometimes recovered with time. But understanding the value of genuine love only after throwing it away carried a different kind of pain. Callan replayed countless conversations with Vivienne Ashford, remembering every quiet act of encouragement he had dismissed, every sacrifice he had eventually taken for granted, and every opportunity he had ignored to thank the woman who stood beside him long before magazine covers, private jets, and corporate awards entered their lives. He now understood why Vivienne never fought to compete with Celeste. She knew that love built upon admiration for wealth could never endure hardship. She also understood something Callan had forgotten during his years of success. Character reveals itself most clearly when circumstances change. Celeste Hawthorne had not broken her promises because she never truly made them to the man beneath the success. Everything she offered had been tied to status, influence, and the appearance of an unstoppable future. Once those things disappeared, the relationship disappeared with them. As Callan quietly lowered his phone and stared through the office window at a city that no longer viewed him with admiration, one painful truth settled into his heart with undeniable clarity. The woman he abandoned had loved him when he possessed almost nothing. The woman he chose instead loved only the version of him who appeared to possess everything. And by the time he finally understood the difference, the life he had sacrificed to chase an illusion was already far beyond his reach. In the weeks that followed his heartbreaking discovery about Celeste Hawthorne, the world around Callan Ashford grew quieter than it had ever been. The once busy headquarters of Ashford Global Holdings no longer echoed with ambitious conversations or confident plans for expansion. Entire floors of the building sat empty after another round of layoffs. The executive dining room, where powerful investors had once competed for his attention, remained untouched for days at a time. His calendar, once filled months in advance, now contained long stretches of empty space interrupted only by meetings with attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors trying to salvage what little remained of the company. At home, the silence felt even heavier. The mansion that had once represented everything he believed success should look like now felt cold and unfamiliar. Every room reminded him of someone who was no longer there. The kitchen where Vivienne Ashford had greeted him every morning stood spotless but lifeless. The garden she had lovingly cared for continued to bloom without her presence, almost as though nature itself refused to acknowledge that she was gone. For the first time in many years, Callan found himself walking through the house without purpose, pausing in doorways simply because every corner carried memories he had ignored while chasing a future that had ultimately disappeared. He wasn't searching for expensive possessions or forgotten financial records anymore. He was searching for understanding. Somewhere beneath years of pride, regret had begun asking questions that success had never allowed him to hear. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through storage boxes in a quiet corner of the house, Callan discovered a small wooden chest tucked neatly behind several old photo albums. The box looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately remember where he had seen it before. As he carefully lifted the lid, he realized it belonged to Vivienne. Inside were carefully organized folders tied with faded ribbons, handwritten notebooks worn smooth from years of use, family photographs from the earliest days of their marriage, and dozens of envelopes containing documents he had never seen before. Curious, he opened the first folder. What he found immediately challenged everything he believed about the story of Ashford Global Holdings. There were receipts showing utility bills, mortgage payments, and business expenses dating back to the years when the company struggled to survive. Every payment had been carefully recorded in Vivienne's handwriting. As he continued reading, he discovered personal notes explaining how she had quietly adjusted household budgets, worked additional shifts, and postponed medical appointments so the company would have enough money to meet payroll. There were months when Callan believed an unexpected client payment had rescued the business, but the documents revealed a different reality. Vivienne had secretly covered critical expenses herself, refusing to tell him because she feared he would abandon his dream if he knew how difficult their situation had truly become. The realization settled heavily upon him. During the years he proudly remembered as his greatest demonstrations of determination, someone else had been carrying burdens he never even knew existed. As Callan opened one journal after another, the hidden story of his success unfolded page by page. Tucked between handwritten entries were business cards belonging to influential executives whose names immediately caught his attention. Many of them had become valuable partners during the company's early years, people he always believed he had met through fortunate timing or personal persistence. Attached to several cards were short notes written by Vivienne, reminding herself to follow up after arranging introductions through charitable events, community gatherings, and longtime family acquaintances she had never mentioned to Callan. There were letters thanking her for recommending his company to potential clients. Others expressed appreciation for her integrity and assured her they would be happy to meet with her husband because of the confidence they had in her judgment. As he read further, another pattern emerged. Whenever Ashford Global Holdings faced unexpected obstacles, Vivienne quietly documented possible solutions before Callan even became aware there was a problem. She recorded conversations with suppliers she had persuaded to extend payment deadlines, outlined strategies for rebuilding strained business relationships, and even listed names of professionals willing to offer guidance whenever Callan needed trusted advice. None of these efforts had been shared with him. She never wanted recognition. She simply wanted his dream to survive. Looking back, Callan realized that many moments he had celebrated as personal victories were actually the result of invisible bridges Vivienne had built long before he arrived. The foundation beneath his success had always been stronger than he understood because someone had quietly reinforced it every time it showed signs of weakness. Then, near the bottom of the wooden chest, Callan found a simple leather-bound journal unlike the others. Its pages contained no financial records or business notes. Instead, they held deeply personal reflections written over many years, documenting Vivienne's hopes, fears, prayers, and unwavering belief in the man she married. She wrote about celebrating every small victory, grieving every disappointment, and reminding herself that love sometimes meant carrying burdens another person never even realized existed. She never criticized Callan, even during the seasons when he slowly drifted away from the values they once shared. Instead, she expressed concern that success might one day convince him he no longer needed the people who had walked beside him from the beginning. As Callan turned another page, his eyes settled upon a single handwritten sentence that seemed to stop time itself. One day he'll believe he built this alone. I only hope he never has to learn how much it truly cost. He read the words once, then again, and again. The page blurred as tears he had spent months refusing to shed finally fell onto the paper. Every interview where he proudly described himself as self-made returned to his memory. Every award acceptance speech. Every time he accepted applause without mentioning the woman whose sacrifices had made those moments possible. Vivienne had seen this future years before it happened. She had recognized the quiet danger of unchecked success, yet instead of becoming resentful, she had simply prayed he would never have to experience the painful lesson waiting ahead. That single sentence broke something inside Callan that neither financial ruin nor public humiliation had managed to reach. For the first time since this journey began, Callan Ashford understood that the greatest loss of his life had never been measured by disappearing contracts, collapsing stock prices, or abandoned business partnerships. Those things, painful as they were, represented only the consequences of choices already made. His greatest loss was sitting quietly inside a leather-bound journal written by a woman who had loved him without condition while asking for almost nothing in return. Vivienne Ashford had never needed recognition, wealth, or public praise to remain faithful to the promises she made years earlier in a small apartment filled with uncertainty and hope. She simply wanted the man she believed in to remember the journey they had shared together. Instead, he allowed admiration from strangers to become louder than gratitude for the person closest to him. Closing the journal gently, Callan rested his hand upon its worn cover and sat silently for a long time, surrounded not by evidence of failure, but by overwhelming proof of a love he had misunderstood until it was far too late. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows, washing over a home that no longer belonged to the future he had imagined. Inside, for the first time in many years, Callan no longer blamed anyone else for what had happened. The truth had finally revealed itself completely, and it carried a weight no courtroom, newspaper headline, or financial statement could ever equal. He had spent years believing success was the greatest achievement of his life, only to discover that the greatest gift he had ever been given was the woman he failed to appreciate until she was gone. Months passed, and the headlines that had once followed every step of Callan Ashford's rise and fall gradually disappeared from the front pages. The financial networks found new success stories to celebrate. Business magazines shifted their attention to younger entrepreneurs, and the corporate world quietly moved on, just as it always does. For a while, people spoke about the dramatic collapse of Ashford Global Holdings as though it were another cautionary tale destined to fade into history. But for those whose lives had been permanently changed, the story was far from over. While Callan slowly learned to live without the influence, wealth, and recognition that had once defined his identity, Vivienne Ashford began writing an entirely different chapter. She refused every invitation to appear on television or publish interviews explaining what had happened behind closed doors. She declined offers from publishers eager to turn her story into a bestseller and politely rejected requests to publicly criticize the man who had betrayed her. Instead, she chose a quieter path. With the encouragement of Alastair Beaumont, she established charitable initiatives dedicated to helping women rebuild their lives after emotional betrayal, financial hardship, and broken relationships. Her work was never motivated by revenge or public sympathy. It grew from personal experience and a sincere desire to remind others that losing someone's love should never require losing your sense of worth. Every woman who walked through the doors of those organizations found someone who listened without judgment, because Vivienne understood pain not as an observer, but as someone who had survived it herself. The programs she helped create quickly expanded beyond temporary support. They offered career training for women forced to start over, financial education for those rebuilding after difficult divorces, counseling services for families navigating emotional trauma, and mentorship opportunities connecting survivors with successful professionals who had once faced similar challenges. Vivienne insisted that every participant be treated with dignity rather than pity. She believed healing began the moment people stopped defining themselves by what had happened to them and started focusing on who they could still become. Her leadership style reflected the same quiet strength that had carried her through every chapter of her own journey. She rarely spoke about herself during public gatherings, choosing instead to celebrate the victories of others. Volunteers admired her humility. Donors respected her integrity. Families whose lives she helped transform often described her as someone who made them feel seen long before offering advice. Alastair Beaumont watched his daughter with unmistakable pride, knowing she had turned one of the deepest disappointments of her life into a source of hope for countless others. Ironically, the recognition Vivienne had never sought during her marriage now arrived naturally because people admired not her wealth, but her character. She had become exactly the kind of leader her father always believed she could be, proving that genuine influence is measured not by how many people know your name, but by how many lives become better because you were present in them. Callan Ashford's life, meanwhile, looked almost unrecognizable compared to the world he once inhabited. The sprawling estate had long since been sold to satisfy outstanding financial obligations. The private jet, luxury vehicles, and exclusive memberships were memories belonging to another lifetime. He rented a modest home in a quiet neighborhood where very few people recognized the man whose photograph had once appeared regularly on magazine covers. His mornings no longer began with meetings involving investors and corporate executives. Instead, they began with simple routines that once seemed too ordinary to appreciate. He made his own coffee, tended a small garden behind the house, read books he had postponed for years, and occasionally volunteered his experience to young entrepreneurs hoping to avoid the mistakes he had made. Those who met him now often found him thoughtful rather than confident, patient rather than ambitious, and surprisingly willing to admit where pride had led him astray. The loss of his fortune had humbled him, but the loss of Vivienne had transformed him far more deeply than financial hardship ever could. There were evenings when he revisited the journals she had left behind, not because he wished to reopen old wounds, but because they reminded him of the kind of man he once aspired to become before admiration from strangers slowly replaced gratitude for the people closest to him. The greatest lesson of his life had arrived at a price he would spend the rest of his years remembering. Then, one quiet autumn afternoon, fate arranged a meeting neither of them had expected. Callan had accepted an invitation to speak briefly at a community leadership event focused on ethical business practices and responsible entrepreneurship. The gathering took place inside a cultural center several towns away, and after his presentation concluded, he wandered through the lobby where several charitable organizations had arranged informational exhibits. As he turned a corner, he stopped without warning. Standing only a few steps away was Vivienne Ashford. She was speaking with a group of young women participating in one of her mentorship programs, listening attentively as they shared their hopes for the future. The conversation ended, and as the group moved toward another room, Vivienne looked up and saw Callan standing quietly across the hallway. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Years of shared memories seemed to exist within that silent exchange. Then something remarkable happened. Vivienne smiled. It was not the smile of someone pretending everything had been forgotten, nor was it the smile of someone secretly celebrating another person's regret. It was a smile free from anger, free from bitterness, and free from the weight of resentment. It reflected the peace she had found by choosing healing over revenge. She greeted him warmly, asked how he had been, and genuinely listened to his answer before wishing him well. There were no accusations, no emotional confrontations, and no attempt to revisit the past. After a few respectful moments, she excused herself and returned to the people waiting for her, leaving Callan standing exactly where he was. As he watched Vivienne walk away, Callan Ashford finally understood the lesson that had been waiting for him since the beginning of this journey. The greatest thing he had lost was never the company he spent decades building. It was never the contracts that disappeared, the investors who quietly walked away, or the wealth that once surrounded his life. Those things had value, but they could never compare to the woman who believed in him before the world knew his name. Vivienne Ashford had loved the struggling dreamer living inside a cramped apartment long before success transformed him into someone he barely recognized himself. She stood beside him when there were no magazine interviews, no luxury homes, no corporate awards, and no applause from strangers. She celebrated victories no one else noticed and carried burdens he never realized existed. In the end, the fortune he believed defined his success proved temporary, while the love he casually overlooked had been priceless all along. Watching Vivienne disappear into a room filled with people whose lives she continued changing through kindness and compassion, Callan felt no expectation that she would return to him. Some chapters are not written to be repeated. Some relationships fulfill their purpose by teaching lessons that can only be understood after they have ended. As he quietly walked toward the exit beneath the fading afternoon light, he carried no anger toward anyone else. Only gratitude for having known a woman whose quiet faith had once changed his life, and deep regret that he had recognized her true worth only after she had already found the peace he could never take from her. Perhaps that is the most enduring truth this story leaves behind. Wealth may open doors, admiration may fill rooms, and success may attract countless voices of praise, but none of them can replace the rare gift of someone who believes in you when you have nothing to offer except hope. Those people are life's greatest treasure, and those who fail to recognize them often discover their value only when the opportunity to say thank you has already passed forever. Every story eventually reaches a moment where the facts come to an end, and only one question remains. In Callan Ashford's case, the company collapsed, the fortune disappeared, the truth was revealed, and the woman he failed to appreciate found peace without seeking revenge. But perhaps the most important question was never whether Callan deserved to lose everything. The real question is whether redemption is still possible after someone breaks the heart of the person who loved them most. If you were Vivienne Ashford, would you have forgiven Callan after everything he did? Could you overlook the lies, the betrayal, the public humiliation, and the moment he asked you to leave the home you helped build? Or do you believe some choices create wounds that can never truly heal, no matter how sincere the apology may be? There are no easy answers because every person carries pain differently. Some believe forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, so the past no longer controls our future. Others believe forgiveness can exist without reopening a chapter that has already ended. Whatever your perspective may be, one truth remains undeniable. Trust takes years to build, moments to break, and sometimes a lifetime is not enough to restore what was lost. Callan Ashford finally understood that success without gratitude eventually becomes emptiness. He learned that loyalty is rarely noticed until it is gone, and that the quiet sacrifices made by those who truly love us often become invisible because they are offered without expectation of recognition. Vivienne Ashford never destroyed his empire. She never sought revenge, demanded justice through power, or asked her family to punish the man who had betrayed her. She simply walked away with her dignity intact, while the unseen support that had quietly protected Callan's journey came to an end. In many ways, his greatest punishment was not losing wealth. It was living with the knowledge that the one person who loved him when he had nothing was no longer beside him when he finally understood her value. That realization cannot be measured in dollars, business contracts, or newspaper headlines. It is carried quietly within the heart, often becoming the lesson that changes a person forever. Thank you for spending this time with us and following Callan and Vivienne's journey from hope to heartbreak, from pride to humility, and from loss to healing. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments. If you were Vivienne Ashford, would you have forgiven Callan, or would you have chosen to walk away forever? Your perspective may help someone else facing a similar crossroads in life. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories filled with unforgettable twists and meaningful life lessons, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Until next time, remember this. Never underestimate the quiet people who stand beside you during your hardest days, because long after success fades and applause grows silent, they are often the greatest blessing you were ever given.